In this session, I want to talk about the contents of a business research plan. Now, writing a research report should contain a discussion of the following sections. The layout of the report. There should be a clear layout for the report. It should be easy to navigate the report, easy to find information, easy to find arguments advanced for and perhaps against. Sources of data should be easily found. So the layout of the report is important, and that should be clearly specified right at the start. There should also be some preliminary pages which may indicate the nature of the study or of the plan, the rationale for the plan, what the plan is attempting to do, the design and issues of design related to the plan, and the timescale, the procedures. So the essential information should be extracted and put into the preliminary pages, and then of course the main text. Now, the layout of the report. Well, the report should enable the reader to understand the importance of the subject. So it should enable the reader to clearly understand the importance of the subject and also the hypothesis that has been tested. A hypothesis is a testable statement. So the hypothesis may be based on observations from the past, or based on a theory, or based on some conjecture that somebody in the company has about some aspect of the business. And that becomes the hypothesis which can be tested. So it should be clearly stated what is being tested. And what's the methodology that's being used? How is the hypothesis being tested? Is it being done by sample survey? Is it being done by interview? Is it being done by focus group? How is it being tested? What is the methodology? What is the method for testing the hypothesis? And the thoroughness of the analysis and its criticisms should also be discussed. How detailed is the analysis? And what are the criticisms of the analysis? And being honest about the criticisms is very important. State the criticisms as a matter of fact, because they are real. If there are criticisms, they are real. And generally speaking, there are always criticisms. The conclusions and the way they are derived from the analysis. So if you look at what we've got so far on the screen, we have the importance of the subject, we have the hypothesis that's been tested, we have some way of testing the hypothesis, the methodology, and the thoroughness of the analysis and the criticisms of the methodology perhaps, the criticisms of the procedures within the report, and then the conclusions. And the conclusions should be based on the analysis. In fact, the conclusions should be based entirely on the analysis. The scale of the research effort as evidenced by the bibliography, the extent of the research, and the insights from the analysis. So the report should contain a good bibliography indicating reading on the subject, reading in the area of the subject. And it should indicate the extent of the research. Now, let's look at the preliminary pages in a little more detail. The preliminary or early pages of the report should present essential information about the report, such as the title and the date. These pages should also include a preface, in other words, a statement about what the project is going to be and why it's important. It should also contain acknowledgements, and these should be given at the end of the preface. So it should thank the people who have cooperated and helped in the production of the business plan or of the report or whatever it is that's been looked into. And there should also be a table of contents, a list of tables and illustrations. So all of these go into the preliminary pages. Now, in the main text, this section should represent a detailed account of the research and provides the complete and detailed outline of the research report. So the main text is where all the heavy lifting is done. The main text is where all the important work takes place. Now, the main text may be divided into a review of the literature, the derivation of the research question, which is called the hypothesis. The research question is what has been asked. The hypothesis is a testable statement, and that's what's been tested. So it may be that the hypothesis comes from the literature. So in nearly all areas, we can imagine there is some past literature. People have written about that particular issue in the past. Go across that past literature, see what's been said, and derive the hypothesis perhaps from that. But this section should also look at the research method to be used and its limitations, the criticisms of the research method. And then we have the empirical work. Now, the word empirical means done by experiment. So it normally applies to the physical sciences. But we use the word in business and in social science and economics and so on to mean practical work, the practical research. We call it the empirical work. So there should be a report in the main body of this report about how the empirical work was conducted, how the practical research was undertaken. And then there should be the research findings. The research findings is what the empirical work has shown to be the case. So the empirical work throws up the findings. And finally, there should be a summary of the research findings. Next, let's look at the analytical section. Well, in the analytical section, we restate the hypothesis. And if we have more than one hypothesis, we have hypotheses, slightly different spelling. So we restate the hypothesis, and then we present a summary of the research findings and an analysis of the relationship between the findings, the research findings, and the hypothesis itself. So, in other words, did the results of the empirical work, did the results of the research support the hypothesis or reject the hypothesis? So, we have very important issues in the analytical section. We have the hypothesis, if there's one, or hypotheses if there are many. We have a summary of the research findings, and we have a relationship between the research findings and the hypothesis, which is C on our list here. In other words, did the research findings support the hypothesis or reject the hypothesis? Now, state the implications of the assessment or analysis. If the hypothesis is rejected by the evidence, clearly state the implications and make recommendations. And likewise, if the hypothesis is supported by the evidence. In other words, don't go out to prove something. Go out to investigate it. Go out to find the true relationship. And having found the true relationship, talk about its implications. So the research must be honest. The practical work, the empirical work, must be done honestly to find out what was the true relationship, and then compare that to the hypothesis and accept the hypothesis or reject it. But it must be done honestly. And there should be a summary that lists and discusses this finding. Present the key findings in a shortened summary of about 100 to 200 words, or let's say a maximum of about 2 pages. The summary is a brief winding up of the analytical section. It talks about the hypothesis which has been accepted or rejected based on the evidence, and what are the implications of that. Now let's look at the conclusion and recommendations for the report. Well, briefly restate the findings from the analysis, because that's what the report did. It did some analysis, it did some practical work, it compared the practical work with the hypothesis, it analysed the hypothesis, in other words, using practical data, and it's important in the conclusion for the report to restate that and to be open about it. It's also very important to be clear about the limitation or the limitations of the study. What were the drawbacks of the study? And that's very important as well. It's important to be honest and state perhaps the sample size was not big enough, or perhaps there were errors and non-responses in the survey material, or whatever. The point is, it's important to be open about that. And make recommendations to show ways in which the research may be improved and the implications of the findings. So, in the conclusions, make recommendations as to how the research could be improved. If it was to be done again, how could it be done better? Now let's look at another part of the report, which would be the appendices. These should simply list and present supplementary material. Now, this may be notes and articles that can't easily be found. So if in the course of doing the research, the researcher found some articles, some perhaps published, or perhaps old published articles, but it would be very difficult for the reader to find those. It would be a real effort. And if it's allowed, under copyright rules, but if it is allowed, perhaps take a copy of it and include it in the appendix. So it makes it easy for the reader to see that particular article as well, particularly if the article is very important. The appendices may also include calculations and statistical material, perhaps tables and statistical manipulations and so on. So it would not be appropriate perhaps to include it in the main body. It would clutter the main argument. So put it into the appendix, number it, and make reference to it in the main body of the report. The same may also be included, may include technical data, for example law reports. These may be put into the appendices. Or if it's a very scientific or engineering based report, some management decision about a piece of engineering, perhaps technical drawings may be included in the appendices. And the questionnaires, if questionnaires are used, and sample information may be also included in the appendices. So that really would constitute what goes into the appendices in the report. Now let's talk about style. Now the writing style should be based on the Harvard system. It should use the Harvard system of referencing. And this is dealt with in a separate video elsewhere in the course. So I'm not going to go into it here, but it is very important that you are familiar with the Harvard referencing system. There are lots of notes online, lots of explanations for the Harvard referencing system. So simply go to Google and type it in and you will get lots of information about it and samples and explanations. But we will also have a separate video class in the course about this, which you will meet later. Now finally, let's have a quick list of sections in the research report. This is just a very quick list, very quickly done. We have the title and the date. We have the preface and the acknowledgements. Number 3, we have the table of contents. Then we have a list of tables and figures or illustrations, which follows the table of contents. Then we have the introduction to the report. We have the review of the literature and the identification of the hypothesis. That's very important. What is the hypothesis? What is going to be tested in the report? Then we have the research section, the area of the research and the objectives. A brief summary of other relevant research so that the present study can be seen in that context. So looking at other work in the area as well as the present work, so the two can be compared. And also the selection of the methodology and the criticisms of any techniques used. It's important to be critical. If the writer is critical, then the reader will find it difficult to be critical as well. The reader will think the criticism has already been done and addressed. So it's important to be critical. And it also shows an awareness that there are issues, always issues, associated with research. It could be better done. It can always be better done. In fact, most things can be better done. And this section simply lists improvements that could be made. So it's the research section, and then we have the analysis, which comes from both the literature review and the empirical section, the research section. The analysis it comes from the literature review because that's where we identify the hypothesis. So the hypothesis is what's been tested. The practical information, the practical analysis that was conducted in the previous section links to that hypothesis. And in the analysis, the hypothesis is accepted or rejected. And that's the finding of the research. And then we have the conclusion. So to summarize the findings in the context of the hypothesis, state the limitations of the work, and make recommendations based on the findings. So the conclusions are in those areas. And then we of course have the bibliography, a list of sources used. They should be by surname and listed alphabetically. So it's easy to find sources in the bibliography because they are listed alphabetically. And then we have the appendices, which we've just discussed a little bit earlier, and what goes into the appendices. And that is our view of the research project. Let's say a business research project, but most of it applies to any research project. That concludes our talk on this one, so thank you for watching.